後卒業時半や腹見た辞書言語保育同意細工役者利子式食育不具意識式即税空空即税式重創業学部尿税者利子税商法空総務商法不空不上不増不減税国中無式無創業式無限意味税式無式商法未足無限界内し無意識外無無明薬無明人内し無老死薬無老死人無復讐滅動無知薬無得意無浄土公母大三角平安やらみたもし無定義無定義無空不音理祭天道無即行で安でしょう
Hello, guys, everyone. We are back again on another episode of GeekWatch because nobody's here. I am going to start the introduction because usually we have another person doing that, but he's not here. So, hi. Hello.
You killed my intro, you. Oh god, I'm clipping that.
Ha 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 ha. I'm always here to ruin the moment.
Yeah, but
That's my skill.
welcome everyone to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the Monastery. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me is the temple's resident observer, good brother Theodore Locus.
Yes, hi. I decided to be quirky today, so sorry about that.
Oh, I hope you weren't spending an afternoon on the booze liner. And Vanguardian in the chat saying, "Hello, teacher. Is there going to be an exam for this?" Yes. So you better be taking notes. Because class is in session, and so, and it is funny. It's funny that Theo and I are in this because bit of a deep lore about I want to say a year or so ago. Him and I did a whole collab just talking about Japanese tabletop.
Yep.
And of course that is the topic for tonight, because one of the big lies that a lot of people say within the TTRPG space is D&D is the standard worldwide. Anyone who tells you this is full of shit, or that's all they know, so they assume that's how it is.
It's not even that hard to disprove, honestly. Like, if you just look at trends of TTRPGs across the globe, you'll immediately understand that no, that's just not how it is.
Now, it's even more so in certain countries, like in Germany, due to a TSR falling out. Though I don't have the full details on that one. The dominant one is Das Schwarze Auge. I apologize for my bad German. Also known as the Dark Eye. I did a review of the 5th edition of the Dark Eye. It is a very good game. Calling it German D&D is a bit inaccurate.
And it's a disservice, I'm pretty sure. It's kind of its own thing.
Well, it also has a dedicated setting instead of a dedicated history that it tries to stick to. There's also the fact that it's more of a roll under 3d20 approach. You're rolling 3 different stats and trying to get under with as many of those d20s as you can.
Roll under systems always fascinate me because it kind of requires you to rewire your brain a little bit, especially if you started in normal, well, quote unquote normal systems in terms of like the mechanics. So it's just like so you see a 1, you're supposed to be happy about it.
This is why I've stated, bit of a side note, but this is why I've stated that Fading Suns is one of my favorite roll under systems because it is and isn't aim low. I've mentioned this plenty of times, but I call it D20 blackjack because the idea is you want to get under the target number, but you want to get as close to it without going over.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach to it, honestly.
Because, yeah, getting a 1 is a success in Fading Suns, but it's a bare minimum success. You want the best success. You want to get as close to it as possible. Like in blackjack, how you're trying to get as close to 21 without busting.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like, okay, so the goal is, for example, 10. The biggest success to it, I would assume, would be 9.
Yeah,
like 9 on 8. That would be like the biggest success.
Mm-hmm. If you roll a 10 in that's actually a botch.
Figured as much.
Mm-hmm. Whereas if you rolled an 11 or higher, that would just be a failure. And
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But as shown, the topic tonight is Japanese tabletop class, because of the different places, whether it be Germany, whether it be Sweden, whether it be Brazil, Japan is an interesting case study of a TTRPG space evolving and developing with within itself and with very little outside I won't say very little outside influence, but not the influence that one would think. And really, it starts with the origin point. So stop me if you've heard this one before. War games get big, and they spawn tabletop games. They spawn tabletop RPGs. Tale as old as time. And given that I used to live in Highland Park, which was the birthplace of Arneson, I'm very familiar with the story. If anyone wants the full story and how things went down, I'd recommend watching the Secrets of Blackmore documentary. It does a good job of breaking it down. But in Japan, there was no wargaming scene for TTRPGs to spring from. That's not to say war games weren't played at all, but there wasn't a scene at the same level. No, instead, Japanese TTRPGs trace their origins more to the computer gaming scene. And one of the earliest examples of this was an adaptation of the Wizardry game series.
Yeah, the Wizardry. I remember researching like the general direction of Japanese TTRPG systems, and while there's still some influence from the West, I would say most of it comes from their own little projects. Like the Wizardry, as you mentioned. The Lotus War, I would say, is one of the earliest examples as well of the TTRPG stuff. Also, the fact that if I remember correctly, I heard this story, but there was never really an abundance of D20s.
No. The big reason why a lot of Japanese tabletops use D6s is because of the fact that they would be the easiest die to get, especially in rural parts of the country. But that version of Wizardry came out in 1988. And a big thing with Wizardry is it was massive in Japan, to the point where you get games like the Black Onyx, which were just a Japanese-made Wizardry clone. Now, my research did hint that some early introductions were things like Donkey Commando and Enterprise roleplay in Star Trek in the early 80s. The first one that did get a Japanese translation was actually Traveler in 84, with the Redbox Menser version of D&D in 85. And here's where things get tricky, because the peak of D&D's relevance in Japan was the Rules Cyclopedia, which was a rules collection of OD&D. I have brought up the Japanese version plenty of times when dismantling the JRPG arguments, because you look at the way the Japanese version of the Rules Cyclopedia is laid out. If you didn't know it was D&D, you would assume it was like Dragon Quest or Lunar or any other fantasy console RPG that was coming out in like the 90s or 2000s. It's a good way to shoot down the whole art style argument when it comes to quote-unquote JRPGs. And I think you've seen the article that went into several of the pages, haven't you, Theo?
Yeah. I do think I have.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about that is that after that there were plans to do a translation of AD&D. Of course, by 1985, not only had AD&D been a thing by that point, second edition was already, I think, out or on its way out. I'd need to check. So let me. So okay, I have to correct myself. AD&D's second edition didn't come out until 1989. But by the mid-'80s, advanced D&D was already out in the States. But the translation for AD&D in Japan was a long and expensive process.
Yeah, it came out, if I remember correctly, it came out much later than it actually came out in the US.
Mm.
And I don't think there was much... the problem of the translation project is that there was not really as much demand for it, as I would say, as even for US, I would say it wasn't even as popular as it is right now. It was always kind of niche, my real research. So it's the entire opposite of a perfect storm, in that it was a very imperfect storm.
Well,
from what I can...
because of the length and expense, the other problem was other companies capitalized. Because by the time it came out, Tunnels and Trolls had come out in Japan, which is a much lighter game, a much smaller game, and a game that primarily used D6s, which was going to be much more malleable to the Japanese audience, especially since it was one smaller book, so it'd be easier to read the thing on like trains and stuff.
Yeah. I think the more complicated systems came in later, once people already got acclimated to the concept of TTRPGs. Even then, more complicated systems like the game we know and love, both of us, Sword World. Even then, all of the books are made in such a way that you don't particularly need other books if you don't need to.
I know I say light, and somebody might look at like Sword World Core Book 1 and say, "Wait, that's light?" Oh. It's not just the page count. It's the fact that it's the size of the book as well. Sword World has a large page count in part because it's a one-column book that's in the page format akin to a large manga. Like those big-ass manga volumes of like Berserk or Vinland Saga or Vagabond that Dark Horse publishes.
Yeah.
There was recently one of those collection things for Vagabond, which is nice. It's nice. I knew it was gonna come eventually, and I may get into it another day. But Vagabond's the only one of the Seinen 4 Pillars of Heaven that doesn't have an anime.
Originally.
which is surprising. You think doing the story of Miyamoto Musashi would be something that a studio would want to do. I don't know, maybe people got scared off with the Blade of the Immortal anime, even though the problem with that was the wrong studio had gotten the job. That was animated by B-Train. B-Train does a lot of things, but doing a detailed seinen action story is not one of them. They're far more of a slow burn kind of studio, to their benefit and sometimes detriment. But getting back on the rails. When it came to Sword World, as has been pointed out in the very well done documentary by the Sword World translation team, that thing came to be out of the fact that the initial goals they had of turning Lodos into an official D&D campaign setting didn't work out. And I don't think we'll ever get the full story as to why. Some people say it was because of language barrier issues. Some people say it was one side not answering the other's calls. It's not consistent. And they just adapted the rules that they had already built for the Grey Witch into it. And of course, the rest is history. And it wasn't a case like that was the plan. The plan for Celia was largely compiled out of Ryo Mizuno's notes that he was already running. Although that being said, I remember saying this to Bradley, just on a historian perspective, I would like to see Blue Forest story translated someday. Like, all we know is that it's set in a world that's similar to Southeast Asia. But I will note that that's probably the first when you really look at the history, the TTRPG scene was more born out of the 90s than the 80s. Like, Sword World started out in 1989. A lot of the early things that came over were obvious things. I know there's talk about the Roads to Lord in '84, but it's really the 90s where things start to pick up.
Yeah. I think initially Sword World was Record of Lodos, or at least somewhat related to it vaguely. If I'm not saying incorrectly.
A lot of people have tried to pull a chicken and egg thing, but the problem is Ryo Mizuno and a lot of the people who would be designers for Sword World, and a lot of the people who were part of the Lodos projects, were all in the same umbrella under group SNE. And because of that, there's not really a chick. It's not really the egg hatching into a chick kind of situation. They both ended up developing alongside each other, especially since the only one who could run AD&D in that group was Ryo. So he knew, I guess, enough English to do it, whereas everyone else couldn't because AD&D wasn't translated.
Yeah.
Obviously there's the whole thing with the replays, which I think Mizuno or somebody else described it as kitchen sink fantasy, just them throwing in a bunch of stuff. Obviously there's the whole thing with Lodos starting as the replays and then expanding out from there into the novels and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of that, by the way, just one comment on that on my side. I feel like there's not enough credit given to the replays culture in Japanese TTRPGs. The way they have entire books of just replays, where you can actually see how the game is played and understand how you make characters, understand what the general vibe of the game is unbelievably cool, in my opinion.
And I think what that ended up helping things further, because a lot of those replays were in the same parts of bookstores that light novels were, which there was already a massive literary movement for decades when it came to light novels.
Light novels is one of the most profitable businesses in the entire Japanese industry right now, in media industry. Often light novels is kind of like a treasure trove right now in terms of like anime, manga, new franchises, all of that stuff. So people come in, buy them, read them on their way to work, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So having these replays would bring an infinitely more amount of eyes to the systems than just having read the rule book, bruh. Like, no, you just have to see how it plays. If you like it, you can play it yourself.
Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I've said that the replay thing is sort of a precursor to actual plays. Though I will admit, I think replays do a little bit better of a job introducing how a game works than a lot of actual plays that I've seen. And a big part of it is some of the replays I've gone through have some explanations of some of the rules as they go, or in a lot of cases they'll have the full-on character sheet of the characters involved, so you can see the translation between the character that you're reading and the final character setup. Like for instance, the obviously the Lodos replays are a big example, but I'd also bring up some of the Sword World replays like Train Travelers. Where you have exactly that. But in addition, there's also the fact that it's not as lengthy of a process. I've been trying to find ways to make the actual play stuff that I do here in the monastery a bit more transparent. It's a work in progress. But I think it is kind of funny looking at it from our perspective, because Theo, I'm pretty sure you've had to dealt with people who have this adversarial attitude regarding video games coming from the tabletop world, or bringing video game stuff into tabletop. You've been in those circles. You've seen it just as much as I have, of people like, no, TTRPGs are where it came from. We don't need any of that video game shit here.
Yeah. Of course.
Or looking down at people who are coming in from the more video game end of things. Doubly so when it comes to anime. And there's not really, because of the fact that nobody told them what to do and what not to do when it comes to the Japanese part of things, you don't really see that problem.
I feel like with Japanese systems, the one thing I noticed is that it's basically a free-for-all. One person can do whatever the hell. Basically, they're just like, oh, I want to do this. Nobody can stop me. I will just do it.
There's nobody telling you that a given game has to be run in like the SRS system that Fear makes, or in the same way that people that if you want to write a fantasy thing, people tell you, oh, how would you do that in this or that system? Most people are just going to make in-house. There's going to be more in-house systems than there are shared ones. The only major shared ones are going to be Sword World's 2D6 system and the SRS system in Fear. And even with that, it's not like there's a whole lot of cross-compatibility.
You don't. That's the thing. I feel like I feel like with the Japanese systems, there is a sense of of them not trying to shove something into like. There's no real systems. I don't think I've seen any real system which are non-specific in terms of worlds they build. Right? There's D&D, which is kind of like there's a lore, there's a world, but it's do whatever. Right?
We've talked about that many times, and one of these days I'm gonna have to do a structured video just dismantling the whole any kind of fantasy lie that D&D players tell me.
Yeah, like it's I've seen it to this day of people trying to shove D&D into modern fantasy games, people trying to shove D&D into horror games, people trying to shove D&D into whatever the fuck they want to, and it just annoys the crap out of me.
We've seen
Genuinely.
You and I saw people trying to shove OSR shit into Sword World.
Yeah.
And
no, no. That's what I admire genuinely about the Japanese systems, in that they don't have a convention or a place where everything must adhere to. Like they have systems like a system like Sword World, which is a fantasy, fair. But there's also other systems which might have taken inspiration from Call of Cthulhu, like say the Imaclore. Little less known systems. There's there's Draco Rouge, which is a complete wacky aesthetic of vampires in the future with everything. Like there's various systems out there, and all of them fit a specific type of glove. Which like you have every vibe imaginable in terms of systems. You don't need to shove a system into something. You can just find a system that does exactly what you want it to do.
Which
has
always been the ethos of my monastery. Of that tailor approach of finding systems for a particular thing instead of acknowledging that one size fits all have its own particular caveats.
One size fits all. I feel like it's the same thing as trying to appease everyone and play into everyone and not being fine and ending up not exciting or interesting anyone in the process. That's the unfortunate part of it.
Yeah. And we'll bring up Sword World when it comes to this. And I will at one point do a video on this in detail. But one of the big lies that D&D players tell me is that you can use it to run any kind of fantasy. Fantasy is a very wide net, and D&D wants to have multiple campaign settings, but only design around each individual one so much. Now, some might bring up Pathfinder and the fact that it has the Galarian setting, which it does, but it doesn't commit to it. And at the same time, they have it that you don't need to use that setting if you don't want to as a selling point. So kind of the whole wishy-washy thing, and this is not something you can be wishy-washy about because, again, you're trying to please everyone. Sword World, by contrast, 1.0 had the Forcellia world. It was built for that world, and Lodos was just a part of it.
Yeah.
And the different regions and the like. The magic system in that world is built for that world and nothing else. Trying to go generic with it, you'd have to answer the elephant in the room regarding someone who plays as a priest, and the fact that the magic system is directly tied to the gods.
Yeah, the specific gods of specific world. I feel like that's the strength, in my opinion, because objectively people can say like, I will build my own world, but like, let's be real, your world sucks. I'm gonna be direct here. Every time you try to build a world, there needs to be a specific mindset and specific way, because often you will forget and overlook a lot of things, and your world ends up making absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's just how it is.
Now,
Not a lot of people can sit down and build worlds.
Yeah.
That's just not a thing.
Now, that's not to say that say the world setup for Celia is extremely detailed. There is a lot of bullet points and a lot of wiggle room for people to personalize it, and help
Yeah.
with when Sword World got its relaunch with 2.0, which you don't really see the whole multiple editions thing unless it's a full on soft reboot. Aside from doing some improvements, which I have gone back and look at the 1.0 Sage, and the 2.0 version is definitely an improvement.
Yeah, definitely. I took a time to read 1.0 stuff, and what they did between 1.0 and 2.0 is that they refined a lot of the concepts that were in 1.0 to a point where it's just like, oh yeah, I like this more.
I also prefer the reason why the game is called Sword World in 2.0 compared to 1.0.
Yeah, same.
In 1.0, it was called that because of the uprising against the magic dictators of Forcelia.
Yeah.
Ending the
in
world.
2.0, in 2.0 the entire world is built by these god swords.
Pretty much the three swords of Genesis, and or rather, if you depending on which part of the lore you're talking about, 4 swords.
Yeah, it depends. I think I've seen it 3, 4, 3, 4. It's actually kind of fascinating how the world of 2.0 and 2.5 is basically a triple post-apocalypse. Like, this is a very fascinating world.
And one of these days we will do a episode dedicated to the world, because there's a lot of stuff that's very fascinating. I mean, you have the fact that all of the only real gods in the traditional sense are the swords of Genesis. You have the first sword, the Sword of Harmony, is the one that created the first gods and allowed for the humanoid races. There's also a bit of an implication that the swords created the magical beasts, but they were too perfect to wield them. Whereas the humanoids were a success. Then you had the sword of freedom, Ignis, and that's where you get that's where you start getting the Barbarous. And I know it would be, and the humanoids and Barbarous's conflict is a key thing throughout the history of the setting. And it would be easy to say one is the good guys, one is evil, but I think the best analogy I could make with humanoid and Barbarous and their relationship is more of Alliance Horde in Warcraft.
I think I would also call it Chaos and Order, in a way, because humanoids in Sword World seems very organized, very settled down, while Barbaros tend to have a very chaotic, very might makes right kind of culture.
Very much so. That's not to say Barbarous can't get organized, but you take out the leader when it comes to them being organized, and everyone else scatters.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I feel like the system itself made some reaches in order for you to understand that the Barbarous aren't exactly always the bad guys in its conventional sense, by introducing all of these systems and rules to play them.
Mm-hmm. Even giving them their own class.
Exactly.
And
like there's a possibility, and it's strongly encouraged, I feel like, to have mixed parties sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is cool. It's really cool.
And of course, the three swords are, I believe, Lumiere is the Sword of Harmony, Ignis is the Sword of Freedom, and Cardia is the Sword of Mana. The third sword was kind of the neutral one. It had a few gods, but nowhere near as many as the other two. and as a means to try and stop the other two from fighting to the point where they might end up destroying the damn planet, it shattered, which is where you get the resource of sword shards, and how you introduce mana into the world, which kind of has it that their magic system is another form of ki, just specialized, since it's dealing with mana that's covering the planet.
Yeah, effectively, I would say so. It's kind of more of an inner energy rather than anything else. Like it really is fascinating to me because of how it's presented. I feel like the magic itself. There's so many magic. Then there's like demons as well. Then there's other things, the void. There's other things that you need to. It's all very nifty, genuinely. Like you can look at the concepts of it all. It's really cool.
The fourth sword, which is something of a blank canvas, is Fortuna. Now, obviously, you had the Fortuna Legacy book that went into transcendent characters, so your epic level play. But in universe, Fortuna is a sword that keeps appearing and disappearing whenever big shit is going to happen. Which is
very characteristic Fortuna. The fortune Fortuna, very characteristic that it happens only at specific moments.
Yeah. Usually whenever someone gets it, some transcendent thing is going to happen. Big shit's going to go down. It is never something where small things happen. It kind of reminds me of when I took the name of Heaven's Sword and Dragon Saber, and kind of went on this whole thing of them being a paired set of swords where that are in this cycle of fate. The heavenly sword is the sword of an emperor. But if that emperor becomes unjust, the dragon-slaying saber manifests and will inevitably kill that emperor, and then become the next heavenly sword. But even, and of course, when it comes to the, I've seen people attempt to try and integrate D&D into Sword World, and there were some admirable attempts, even by some of the translators, but it really can't be done all that easy.
Yeah, I feel like it's a different vibe. It's too much. It's too different, in my opinion.
Just with the spell systems alone, you'd have problems, since
yeah.
You know, and this is something else to consider. When you look at a lot of media across East Asia, Japan being no exception, that hard line between martial and magic isn't as hard line as one might think.
No, it's never as hard line. I noticed, like, even in traditional media, when it comes to martial arts as a thing, they're often associated with a very magical approach to it, like wuxia. Wuxia? Is it wuxia or wuxia? Yeah, wuxia. Wuxia by itself is very magical. Like, it's very magical. You don't really have it's like I just punch and kick. You punch and kick and cause dragons of mana to surprise, or control. Even like fucking legend of the Avatar, which was based around the concept of Eastern martial arts, involves bending the nature to your will as martial art, effectively.
There's also the fact that what would be considered a wizard in a Western fantasy setting, you put them in a wuxia setting, and they're just another type of kung fu practitioner, just of a different type. You know, and even if you look at characters in fantasy anime, that hard line doesn't really exist as hard. And I see Vanguardian saying, "Fortuna, you mean the goddess of luck?" Not necessarily in this case. Fortuna in Sword World is more emblematic of fate more than luck. But getting back to what I mentioned, let me bring up one of my favorite fantasy anime, Orphan, Sorceress Stabber Orphan. Imagine trying to take Orphan, formerly known as Chrysanello, the Stabber, which are magical assassins, and the man with the title, the successor of the Razor's Edge, and try and put him into any of the standard casting classes in any edition of D&D.
That's very hard to do because, like, he is a sorcerer.
Mm-hmm.
He is a sorcerer, but he's also a martial. But he's fighting. He's a fighter. He's a bit of a rogue. He's a bit of a here and there. Like, it's very hard to genuinely make it without mixing and matching, I would say, in normal systems.
And in something like D&D, while multi-classing is a thing, trying to multi-class and doing it without being the worst of both worlds is like pulling teeth.
You either do the most optimized guide ever, build ever, or don't do it at all.
Mm-hmm. And in that same, and if it struggles for a character like Orphan, it would actively wither for characters in any major fantasy or isekai anime in the last 10 years. Like, imagine trying to do that. Imagine trying to stat out any of the characters in, say, Mashal. Or if I want to really murder the concept, imagine statting out any of the characters from, like, Fairy Tail or Gash Bell.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Fairy Tail is one of the primary examples of martial arts as magic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no matter how you look at it, most of them are not conventional wizards or sorcerers at all.
And the same thing applies with Black Clover or anything like that. And I know some people will point out, well, what about the characters in Lodos? Wouldn't they translate because they translated early on? Even then, not really. Like when it comes to the characters who we know, it doesn't really work. Like, imagine trying to stat out Deedlit, for example.
Like, I'm just laughing at this point.
Mm-hmm. Even Parn you'd struggle with.
Like, there's a certain way I feel like a lot of the Western TTRPG players look at this stuff. Like, you can simply by the memes and by, like, how people view this in the cultural osmosis of it all, right? That simply does not apply to anywhere except the Western scene. And it's just like, it's such a funny thing that they never really realize it. They think it's a universal thing.
Well, when you're familiar with the allegory of the cave, when all you see is the cave, you think that's your whole world. You think that's all that there is.
Yeah, but then you look at the systems like, I'm looking at your stream right now, like Convictor Drive, for example, right? Mm-hmm. It's entirely different from anything I think I've seen in terms of.
I've seen some people call Convictor Drive Kamen Rider the TTRPG, but that's not the whole truth.
No, I feel like I do like how Convictor Drive takes a risk of being uncomfortable. That's what my favorite part about this is.
But the more important thing with Convictor Drive is that instead of trying to be Kamen Rider the TTRPG, which I always advise someone don't do that, pick a more specific Kamen Rider and build or set of Kamen Riders on a similar theme and build around that. Same thing with any other long-running tokusatsu.
Yeah. Tokusatsu is generally not It's too different. It's kind of like trying to adapt an anthology. It's not going to work.
There's a reason why you don't see as many quote unquote anime RPGs as you may have 30 years ago. But Convictor Drive has much of its DNA tied to the more tech-based Kamen Rider in general, and specifically Kamen Rider Faiz. I believe Faiz was name dropped, as well as Iron Man and Hiroaka were name dropped.
Yep.
And to a certain extent, I'd also say the Space Sheriff trilogy of Metal Heroes, especially when you look at the Adept type of drive in that game. But
yeah,
you also have the fact that there's been plenty of attempts to adapt various video games into tabletop form or various anime. I know that there's one of Sword World, which, even though I don't care for Sword World, I'd still want to take a look at it just to see how it works. There was a Scrapped Princess game that used Sword World's 2d6 system, but it's not compatible with Sword World. Because it doubles down on having more of a skill system rather than the multi-class system Sword World has, along with a bunch of other things that wouldn't transfer over. For the same reason, even though Goblin Slayer and Sword World use the same 2d6 system, they're not compatible.
Not compatible at all.
Yeah, and the other thing to point out with Convictor Drive is that it also has its own world that is focused in the Yokohama region. A bold choice, in my personal opinion, since everybody wants to do fucking Tokyo. Going with Yokohama is a bold decision. I certainly know and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that I have Tokyo Conception on this thing, and I've been doing the month of Megaten. We just finished our deep dive on Tokyo Conception, and
Shin Megami Tensei is a whole different genre. I feel like at this point, like genuinely.
Yeah, and I did some deep diving into the various SMT games in preparation, and even went as far back as to read the original Digital Devil Story novels. And things get wild. Things get all over the place.
They do. That's part of Shin Megami Tensei as
Mm-hmm.
a thing. I feel like people look at Persona and they don't realize how neutered it is compared to what Shin Megami Tensei was. In terms
That's
of
why I always
how
laugh
wild...
whenever somebody gets on their high horse about how offended they are of certain characterizations in Persona. I'm like,
It's completely neutered. It's very simple and neutered and not non-offensive in a lot of ways, I feel like.
and I'm sitting there going, do not fuck with Megami Tensei fans. We are criminally insane.
Exactly.
And Megami's like, wait, SMT has novels? It started as a novel. Megami Tensei
Started as a
Devil
novel.
Story.
It started as a novel, then spawned a game series. Many games, many different games, all different
The first
genres.
games weren't even done
different
by Atlas. The first Majin Tensei was technically the third adaptation. There were two games, although they're really the same game with two different ports, that were done by Telenet. And those games played less like the dungeon crawl we're more familiar with, and more like Gauntlet. There was one on the PC98 engine and one on the MSX. And between the two of them, the PC98 version is the superior version, if for no other reason than you can shoot diagonally. Also having
innovation!
Also having better graphics.
What innovation!
But for some reason, you can't shoot diagonally while moving. But then Majin Tensei the Majin Tensei stuff on the Famicom would be the direction going forward. Although going back and looking at those, there's a lot of handbraking, and also it's part of the reason I have a pathological hatred for Loa anytime it shows up in any Mega 10 game. Loa in the early days could force you to lose levels permanently.
Those were the days, huh? Those
And
were the days.
permanent level downs, no matter what game it's in, tabletop or otherwise, anyone who defends those should walk the plank.
Yeah, same. I agree. I feel like games in earlier days were overly punishing in a lot of ways, like genuinely overly punishing. They could be
Well,
fun in some
a
ways,
lot
but
of
they
it
were
is due
also
to
OP fun.
a lot of that is due to the limitations. Like the reason Nintendo Hard is a thing is because third parties can only make a limited amount of games a year with the seal of approval.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
make them as challenging as possible, so they get so we get the most amount of hours with them. And although in some cases, I think some people just didn't know how to didn't quite get how to balance their games yet. It's the same reason why I say, as much as I love the original Descent hates you.
That hates you. Yeah, definitely.
Especially, and there's a special place in hell for whoever put hit scanners in that thing. Because it's especially putting them behind doors that you manually open, and they shoot at you before the doors fully open.
Yeah. Yeah, Descent is a special descent into madness.
But it was the first shooter that had 6 degrees of freedom, and they didn't know how to balance that. So pioneers make these kind of mistakes. It's just the nature of the beast.
It is, unfortunately. When something is done for the first time, it's kind of excusable to make mistakes in how to execute it, because how the fuck do we know how it works?
And in a similar vein, when I look at the Japanese scene, a lot of the more simulationist aspects that were in early games gradually got phased out as we get into the 2000s.
I noticed in recent systems too, and 2000s, a lot of the more narrative elements took more over rather than anything else. You have a lot of narrative. Narrative is the beast that controls a lot of the TTRPGs, which is very unique and different from a lot of Western, because Western systems are governed by the rules, while Eastern systems tends to go more into the free form style.
And it is worth noting that even with the saying, "Oh, one side is doing this, one side is doing this," keep in mind that those are broad strokes. There are always going to be exceptions, even more so as cross-culturalism becomes more of a thing with communication.
Yeah.
And I'm not ashamed to admit that some aspects of Sword World have crept into the design of FF Legend. It's
I feel like
it's not overt.
I feel like learning from things that works is part of the process. So yeah.
But a big reason, I'd say one of the big things that is definitely consistent across the Japanese TTRPG scene is scenario-based design. Now, a lot of this is due to the fact that time is a precious commodity, and you're not going to see lengthy multi-session campaigns, but rather one-shots or episodic affairs. Though, personally speaking, I think episodic design is a natural fit. I've been designing my individual sessions like TV episodes for decades. Aside from the fact that everybody is familiar with the 3-act structure or the 4-act structure in Japan and other parts of Asia, that's another story. But by structuring it that way, you can have an adventure in a single session, and you can leave wiggle room to expand on it if you want to continue it. Now, I've been told by some folk that a lot of sessions are handled by like renting out a karaoke room, as opposed to having it done in somebody's place. Though,
yeah,
I don't know how much of that is the case nowadays.
It's definitely more. How do I say it? Japanese people are by nature very reserved folk. They don't really bring a lot of their stuff, a lot of their nerdy stuff home as much. What they do often is that they either rent out karaoke rooms, or, which is more prevalent nowadays, they go to specific game spaces
Yeah,
like
those we've been
internet
seeing those
cafes
all.
or
We've been seeing more of those dedicated game rooms and stuff, um, all over the place in the last 7 years at least.
yeah, they have a lot of internet clubs
Mhm.
that opened in recent decade. Um, a lot of those internet clubs are actually kind of unique because they allow you to stay overnight.
Mhm.
So there is also a culture of taking a booth for yourself, a big booth.
Mhm.
You can have a group of people, and you just go there on a weekend, and you spend the whole day or like a night in there. You have all the books you need, you have all the dice you need, you have all the internet and music and whatnot, and you just spend your time together with your group, and you play the game, and you're gonna go home or go do whatever else you need to do. But the general culture is that meeting on neutral ground and playing there with the comfort, with all the snacks, all the stuff, all the idle chatter in the background. That's genuinely how it's done.
Mhm. Yeah, and
That's at least as to my understanding.
mhm. Yeah, that certainly tracks. That certainly has the particular pattern. Um, and I will admit, for the longest time, this particular space was one that was tricky for non-Japanese speakers to delve into unless you got really lucky with fan translations. And the main reason I would become aware of it was because I would spend my time on places like TG or the Forge or the like, where some people would post unofficial translations, and it was slim pickings. And you just, if you were, even if you prayed that you'd get lucky, that would not be enough. You could have a whole church, a whole cathedral praying that you'd get lucky, and it still wouldn't be enough.
I want to take a moment to say thank you, Lion Wing Publishing. Thank you.
Yeah, since they have been Lion Wing and the dedicated fan translators are doing God's work. And,
Thank you, guys. We appreciate you. Genuinely, we do.
and I'd like to hope that it has a bigger impact me saying they're doing God's work because I'm a monk. Remember, folks, monks have sometimes had to pay double duty as priests. But I've covered that whole thing, and admittedly, a lot of the ones we've talked about lean into fantasy. But I could only put so many covers on there, so these are the ones I picked. I do want to spend a bit of time in the future diving into the fan translated Long Horizon RPG. And there's been
I heard good things about it.
There's been things like Filled with Online, which the fan translation got the blessing of the creator to become an official translation. And that is a massive book that is completely free. So throw that at anyone whenever they say, I don't want to spend $200 on, I want to spend $200 or $500 on core books. Here's the full playable game for free.
My probably favorite aspect of Japanese, one of favorite aspect, is how they're not afraid of playing with modern urban fantasy. Something that basically I feel like Western people are kind of afraid of doing, and they're not because they don't really see a lot of it. But Japanese systems play with a lot of urban fantasy, like Kamigakari, like Double Cross, like a lot of other systems similar to that. It's just so fascinating to see how they utilize elements of mythology, utilize elements of like devotion and gods to kind of like just you genuinely see like, Kamigakari. You can straight up be a heroic spirit in there. It's just so it's almost shameless how it is.
Yeah, if we want to talk shameless, I could bring up some of the stuff I've seen out of Brazil.
Yeah, it's like a lot of the like you can have the Fate franchise, right? The Fate franchise.
Yeah.
Obviously, the creators of Kamigakari were the fans of Fate franchise. How do you know? Because you can be a heroic spirit in
And
in their game.
while there was an attempt at a Fate RPG in the fan community, it was using Unisystem, which has its own hurdles that you have to deal with, and it was made very early in the tenure of the Nasuverse. It's more of a Nasuverse RPG than a Fate RPG, but I think part of if there's any analogy, I'd say that the TTRPG scene in Japan has a lot more in common with the indie scene.
Would say so, yeah.
And a big reason, and the big advantage in both is that there's not really someone saying, "Oh, you have to do things a certain way." And also, hi there, Cirrus. I'll be getting to. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about that. But I don't think doing a Fate RPG would be all that tough with the whole master-servant system. And
It wouldn't be. Not really.
there's a couple reasons why I say that. There's a game I've covered years ago called Era Lost Legend by the good folks at Era Games and by Shades of Vengeance. And that one automatically has corporeals and ethereals in a kind of partner system. And that can be played by two people or it can be played by one person. I have seen people do the symbiotic character, with somebody either with multiple personalities or somebody sharing a body or that kind of thing. Your Yugi Motos and the like. And in that same vein, years ago, I was a player in a Fate game, and my servant was a rider class incarnation of Paul Bunyan.
Interesting.
Now, I know some would say, shouldn't he be a berserker? No, he was summoned as a rider because not only was he brought along, but one of his noble phantasms was Babe the Blue Ox. And because of though we had a bit of a running gag of using some of my tall guy jokes at his expense, because normally he's supposed to be giant, but he had to be hyper compressed. The problem is it makes him. The problem is the density is still there. Which means he can't get on most transportation because he's too heavy. He's too heavy, but his body is incredibly dense. So he's able to be bulletproof without wearing bulletproof vests. It's just that his skin is so dense that any bullet just bounces off. I mean, you fire a machine gun at him, it's still going to hurt like hell, but it's not going to pierce.
Understandable. Though, to be fair, I feel like servants by themselves are not exactly susceptible to conventional means of weaponry. Anyway.
Are you familiar with the expression accuracy by volume?
Yeah, I suppose that's fair.
Yeah. But I mean, I did, and a big reason why I specifically wanted to do that is because I've wanted to take alternative approaches with fantasy, and when it comes to that, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Tokyo Nova, which is one that I really, really want to run in the future because it is hitting so many of my high points. You have that OVA 80s and 90s era of Japanese cyberpunk. You have an alternate setting, alternate history. So that's two of my high points. You have a mixture of technology and supernatural elements, and
Yeah.
it's using cards as its core mechanic.
Yeah. Cards are cool.
Yeah, and I will always stand using cards because even to this day I feel like that is severely underrated in terms of what can be done with a set of playing cards as a resolution mechanic. And I do not want to hear anyone bring up Savage Worlds to me. They just use that for initiative. That doesn't fucking count.
I'll be back in a moment. You can continue.
Yeah, but there's a lot that can go into with Tokyo Nova, but I do want to dedicate some time to it specifically, especially since we now have some reliable translations. And of course, there's going to be Where's Blade sometime this year, which I am very much looking forward to that. And there was even stuff like Embryo Machine, which started out as a board game, got a tabletop RPG adaptation, and I'm never going to say no to more mecha. And for those who need mecha with waifus, we have Princess Wing, so you've got that covered as well. But the thing with all of these is that they either are designed for something more broad scope or designed with a setting in mind. The key thing there is they've made a conscious decision one way or another. This is where I have a problem with something like D&D because it wants to play both sides of the aisle. Whereas I don't have this problem with, say, Savage Worlds because that's intended to be a universalist system. People just make their own settings to add to it. But you've got to pick one or the other. You can't do both. You try and do both, nobody wins. And I know that class changes are a thing, but something to keep in mind with that campaign I did years ago, Ethereal. This was the very early days of Fate. Like, the first anime and the visual novel were all I had access to. I know it's difficult to look at that kind of thing in hindsight with all the info and all the material we have of Fate now, but different time, different rules. And because of that, the differences that are gonna be quite a bit. The whole changing class, that wasn't even considered at that time because the info for that we didn't have. And I know some people will dunk on the original anime for how many things got changed and them trying to take in bits and pieces from the 3 different routes, but it was a different kind of energy at that time. So the creative process is always a continuum. By the way, Theo, you back yet, or should I filibuster some more? I'm assuming not. But something else I would bring up is the fact that there's a lot of games that are in a tankobon design, and in some cases you have full-on manga artists doing their own game. That was the case with Tenra. And before I get into that, I want to note that I had a bit of an old bone to pick with whoever was managing the social media for Kanekawa's US branch. Because when some time ago, they advertised that the Trashcast podcast, along with Demon Dice, were going to be doing a actual play of the Konosuba RPG. and called it the first Japanese tabletop to get an official translation. That's a fucking lie. I was there. The first one was made by Ryo Kamiya in 2008. And if anyone goes, no, but that wasn't an official translation. No, it was. It was an official translation that was sold. I have the whole book. I got a physical fucking copy of it. So, and anyone who says otherwise, no. You can claim it's just your opinion, but your opinion is wrong. It is a wrong. This isn't it's a free country and you're free to be wrong kind of thing. No. Saying that Konosuba was the first one to get a translation is deliberately false. And to quote Megatron, you're either lying or you're stupid. And in the case of whoever was running that social media, I'm just going to assume they were stupid. Because a lot of people in that crowd think there's only one game that exists. And even though there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, they want to continue that lie. Or maybe they'll try and defend themselves by saying that they're just a layman on a podcast full of geeks. But hang on a second. I was about to ask if the mount was Babe. As I understood it, the rider doesn't necessarily need to have a mount, just a companion animal, or some sort of companion beast, or something like that.
Return.
Oh, thank you. You're back. You missed out on me yelling about how when Trash tasted that actual play and tried to claim that the Konosuba RPG was the first Japanese tabletop to get officially translated, and I'm like, no, it wasn't. That was Made. I know Made's a weird, cracked out game, but that was technically the first. In 2008.
Yeah, it was the first, yeah.
As far as official translations, yeah, Made was the first. Tenra was the second. I am a bit disappointed that we never got Tenra War, because that looks like it would be so much up my alley. You know, just from...
It is what it is, unfortunately.
Just from the screenshots I've seen. Oh, you got a BRB again?
No, I'm just drinking.
But I think one of the more interesting ones when you talk about modern is Shinobi Gami.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, honestly.
It kind of is. It has this kind of grid thing. I'm trying to think if it was that or a different one where one of the fail states is using your plan's secret technique, i.e., if you use it, you're out. You know, one of the big parts of the game is not revealing what clan you're from by you through that technique. Of course, I brought up Double Cross earlier, which some will debate about whether or not it's fantasy or not, or whether it's SF. I think it's one of those that straddles the line, especially given how broad the Renegade virus is in that setting, to the point where inanimate objects can be infected with it. And of course, I've done interviews on things like Picaresque Roman, which I remember people saying that it was like Yakuza meets Persona, but if I'm being honest, it feels more like the former than the latter.
Yeah. Also, speaking of Yakuza, have you seen the pirate thing?
Yeah, what I see it as, what Skull and Bones could have been if it was done by anybody else.
Oh.
But I think what's interesting about Shinobigami is how its skill system is on a grid of tags of single word tags. So if you don't have the skill, you can use a skill that's close to it, but each space between is adding to the difficulty.
I mean, yeah, it's one of those things I enjoy about general philosophy. That you can make super specialized characters, like super specialized characters. Just funny.
Yeah, whenever it comes to, I think something else I've been noticing in the indie space and as I explore the Japanese tabletop space is having mechanics to build around the fact that your character is not just an isolated person. Like,
Ooh, gasp! What a surprise! You have to build into a team in the game that is reliant on a team. Oh, gasp!
yeah, but in the early days there were a lot of individual design kind of things, and you know, in something like Shinobigami, you have a section just dedicated to people that you have relationships with. You have a similar thing with Mega 10. You definitely have that with Convictor Drive. You have to, and even Sword World, you have that to a point with the reputation system and the inbuilt assumption that your characters are associated with the Adventurers Guild.
Yeah, and also like Double Cross literally relies on you having bonds to not die,
or at least not turn into. Dying would be the easy part. The hard part would be
not turn into a monster.
Yeah. And do you know what kind of fan base I would recommend Double Cross to? People who are fans of Tokyo Ghoul.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's very similar vibe in that sense.
I know some will be like, well, Tokyo Ghoul was way too edgy, and I'm like, stop just that's a wonderful opinion. Did Giga give it to you? And I only point that out because I saw his video and he spent more time talking about the question of whether or not Tokyo Ghoul was edgy than actually talking about Tokyo Ghoul.
Yeah. I feel like the edgy argument gets used a lot, and it's just not productive because, like, yeah, sure, it's dark, like, right? It's dark, like, but it also fits the narrative. Like, if it fits the narrative, what the fuck? It's not edgy. It's dark. It makes sense. But yeah, like, I feel like in Double Cross, people often don't realize, but the system itself is pretty dark. Example, I seen a game being played after I recommended a system to someone, right? And they used it instead of used Double Cross instead of what they originally planned to, which was 5e, which is the reason I recommended Double Cross, because this is a system that can do what they wanted much better. And there has been people who grew up on Western games that complained immediately how unfair and punishing it is that you have this system that will kill you if you use your abilities a bunch. Like, it's just like, it's so stressful. I'm like, yeah, it's a pretty dark game. It's just, I don't know, it's yeah.
What I look at it as something. You may recall earlier in the month I did that collab with Shiro, and one of the things he brought up that he realized in talking with me is that TTRPGs are a universe, not just one thing. And I think that's something that a lot of people have to start realizing, that there isn't just much like how video games in various genres are a universe into themselves instead of one mode of thinking. The same thing needs to be applicable with tabletop. And some people are like, oh, nobody's gonna think that. It's like, the only reason that is defeatist thinking, and we do not do that here in the monastery.
For sure.
And that it's for that reason that I wanted to highlight the TTRPG scene in Japan with this episode, because it definitely shows that nature of it being a universe instead of being one thing that is the normal. Like, double cross being too hard is only really applicable when you have this idea of the way things are supposed to be. Whereas if you take a more flexible approach, then you're going to be able to realize that's not the case. And I think that's as strong of a coda as we will get to. I know this was going to be a shorter one, but things ended up happening when things ended up being late. Chaos ended up happening, especially with a certain thing that I will be making an announcement about in a little over a week. So 1 week from Monday, I will have a significant announcement about something regarding the future of the monastery. In addition to some of the other news that dropped on my social medias, I'll probably be doing a video covering both of those things. And of course, throughout the week, I will be doing plenty of interviews. I got one with a developer in Germany. I've got one return thing that's going to devolve into us talking about ProRes, especially since we're just coming off of Battle in the Valley and Wrestle Kingdom. And of course, wrapping up Devil City Tokyo on Wednesday, and starting the Valley of the not the Valley of the Judge, but the Cloister of the Dice is run with Ogre Gate on Saturday. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk, and join the watch.